subordinate questions, was there a world, a real world, that Homer's poems referred to? If so, what world was it? Was it the world of the Mycenaean Bronze Age? Was it the world that succeeded that Bronze Age that we call the Dark Ages? Was it the world in which the tradition says Homer himself lived, that we think of as the transition to the classical, well, first to the archaic and then to the classical period, the period in which we think about the dawn of the polis? That really is the question we are wrestling with. And of course, behind it all is the idea, can we see any historical information from Homer's poems at all? It would be a terrible blow to me and everybody else in the field if the answer was no, because just about everything we have to say about this period between the Bronze Age and the emergence of the polis, most of it involves inferences from our understanding of what the Homeric poems tell us. But I think we need to take a hard look at what we can do. And I thought it would be worthwhile reading a sentence each from the introductory paragraphs that we provide for you in the problem to show you the range of opinion that is pretty representative of what scholars think or have thought on the subject. Moses Finley says, if then the world of Odysseus is to be placed in time as everything we know from the comparative study of heroic poetry says it must, the most likely centuries seem to be the 10th and the 9th. That is to say, what we call the Dark Ages. Anthony Andrews says it may be that the epic tradition had at some stage used as a model for the army before Troy an idealized version of some of those bands of colonists who settled the coast of Asia Minor in post-Mycenaean time. And if you look at the whole story that he tells, that really means quite soon after the fall of the Mycenaean world, probably maybe a century earlier than what Finley suggests. And then A.M. Snodgrass says, I offer this as a further argument against the existence of a historical Homeric Bible. Isn't anything to be found, is what Snodgrass says. Ian Morris writes, the balance of probability seems to be in favor of a consistent basis to the society of the poem, derived from Greece in the 8th century BC, which would be at the end of the period we've been talking about, the transition to the world of the polis, Homer's own time when he lived and wrote. And finally, Barry Strauss says, ironically, the more Homer exaggerates, the more authentic he is as a representative of the Bronze Age. So what do we do? Well, all of these are learned and clever men, but I don't think that they're all equally right. But what I should also report to you is that I think there is a widespread consensus among most people who study the subject. That doesn't mean that consensus is correct, but not all of these opinions are shared by the same number, by no means, of scholars. Some of them are far out. I would say the one that says you can't learn anything from this is an outlier. The notion that this is about the Mycenaean world is an outlier. And then you get, I would say, the large consensus is something like Finland's consensus, but people verging in both directions from that. course, I already mentioned the poems of Homer turn out to be a very large source for what we're. Secondly, there are legends that the Greeks told about their early history, which come down to us in later sources. And if they are available to us through the sources, the great question is, should we use them at all? And if we do, how carefully should we use them, and so on. This is a good time for me to make a confession so that you'll know how to judge what I say all through the course. Um, Beginning, well, I would say prior to the late 18th century, when a German scholar began to look at the Homeric poems specifically, very, very carefully, and then really very, very skeptically, and to make all sorts of suggestions that the poems we have really not to be thought of as the work of a single poet only who wrote them both out together, but who began to divide them up into early and late elements, which I thought drove the field of classics insane for about 100 years, while they were supposed to argue about the unity of Homer, the unity of not the unity of one of the poems, and so on. But it began a critical study of the poem for the first time, and a critical method to apply to history for the first time, really, in the early 19th century and thereafter. And it became proper to reject any ancient story that wasn't really nailed down very, very firmly by some prophets. To take a skeptical view. And a very interesting example of how things change. If you look at people, say, English and writing about ancient Greece in the late 18th century, they tell the story of the early days based upon the legends as though the legends were reliable information to some degree. When you get to the, say, the middle of the 19th century and the work of the great English historian of ancient Greece, George Grote, he begins his story in 776 with the Olympic Games. He does tell you all about the legends first, but he puts them aside and says, they're just legends. Now let's talk history. He doesn't begin that until the 8th century BC. And so there is this critical school that says, I won't believe anything unless it is proven. At the other extreme, there's me, the most gullible historian imaginable. My principle is this: I believe anything written in ancient Latin or Greek, unless I can't. Now, things that prevent me from believing what I read are, they are internally contradictory, or what they say is impossible, or different ones contradict each other. They can't both be right. So in those cases, I abandon the ancient evidence. Otherwise, you've got to convince me that they're not true. Now, you might think of this as indeed gullible. A former colleague of mine put this thing very, very well. He spoke about, I like to claim this approach, the position of scholarship which we call the higher naivete. And the way this works is, you start out, you don't know anything, you're naive, you believe everything. Next, you get a college education, and you don't believe anything. And then you reach the level of wisdom, the higher naivete, and you know what to believe, even though you can't see it. Okay, be warned. I'm a practitioner of the higher naivete. So I think the way to deal with legends is to regard them as different from essentially sophisticated historical statements, but as possibly deriving from facts, which have obviously been distorted, misunderstood, misused, and so there was a revolution, he was against Great Britain. I'm sure we would know that the French assisted in that. I'm certain we would know that George Washington was the commander of our forces in that battle. Those are easy. There's no getting around to know those things. And then it gets to the words to me. We speculate. We would know as a fact that George Washington threw a silver dollar across the Rappahannock River. Except that it's impossible. We would be told that he was very honest and told his father to chop down a cherry tree, which would be baloney. So, but I think we would be told also one. Said, and what we could see. The palaces were like the palaces that he described. The world that they lived in was a world in which bronze was what was used for implements and weapons and such, not iron, and that's squared with what was found in Mycenae. What was found in the Mycenaean world, namely bronze implements and fundamentally not iron weapons. Sometimes there were interesting little problems that emerged. One of those has to do with the use of chariots in warfare. Well, Homer has chariots as a hero using chariots. And we know
know that chariots were used in warfare in the Bronze Age around the Mediterranean Sea. We have hard evidence of that. Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. So you would say, well, that's another place where Homer got it right. Except for the fact that we also know how chariots are used in warfare. And the closest analogy, I think, is to think of chariots as tanks. One famous tactic is if you have an infantry force coming forward, you send tanks in it to break up the line of the infantry, and so that you can defeat the infantry in that way. And apparently that is the way you use chariots in ancient Bronze Age warfare. You would send a chariot racing toward the line of infantrymen, and the usual outcome was the infantrymen would panic in the face of being charged by these things, and would break their line and give the other side an opportunity to wreak havoc with their army. So what did the Homeric heroes do with their chariots?
I'm getting it fixed, don't worry about that. I'm checking it twice. Maybe even 3 times. Oh, that's fucked.
The memory of chariot warfare back in the Mycenaean days lingered, was captured in the poetry that goes back, the bits of the poetry that goes back to the Mycenaean period, but how they were used was forgotten. And so the poets in the subsequent years then thought, how would I use a chariot, never having seen a chariot fight in a battle, and that's the outcome. So Finley particularly makes a lot of this as being rather indicative of how he pictures the poem's work. There are sort of legitimate memories, some of them going way back to the Mycenaean period, but which may be misremembered in some significant detail. And then, of course, there's lots of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the Mycenaean period. His view is much, if not most, of what we are told about the Homeric world comes, as he says, in the 10th and in the 9th centuries. One other thing that he doesn't mention, but I think is worth mentioning, many a scholar is very reluctant to admit that there's any Mycenaean stuff here, whatever, although they cannot fail to concede that some of the physical implements that are found at Mycenaean sites are precisely like what Homer said. But I think you can go a little bit beyond that. Some scholars have pointed out that in Book 2 of the Iliad, in the section that we call the Catalog of Ships, the poet lays out just exactly how many warships came to Troy from Greece, and just exactly how many came from each town. And the names of the towns that are listed in that catalog of ships, first of all, are all legitimate in the sense every one of them we know did exist in the Mycenaean period. And perhaps no less significant is that there are also towns listed there that are Mycenaean towns which disappeared after the Mycenaean period. In other words, they couldn't just have named towns that used to be Mycenaean but were still around, so that's why they knew them. No, some towns that had disappeared, the names of those towns show up in the catalog of ships. There's just no way to explain that except to say that catalog of ships goes back to the Mycenaean period. Now, the differences between what we find in the Homeric poems are also very illuminating, differences between that and what we know happened after the fall of the Mycenaean world. For instance, one of the most striking things that you find in cultures, anthropologists and archaeologists live off this, is what they do with dead bodies. Now, Mycenae, it's obvious. They bury them in the ground, as most of us do. The graves in the circle, the shaft graves, and then the beehive tombs for the big shots. But even outside the countryside, we find graves which have bones of people in them. But we know that the Greeks in Homer don't do that. The Greeks in Homer have incinerate the bodies of the dead. Remember the Iliad ends with the actual cremation of the bodies of the relevant people. So that's a very significant difference. That memory had simply died out. And it helps us to remember, too, the tombs that we have seen now. They didn't see that whoever was writing the poems of Homer, whichever poets were contributing to that over the ages after the Mycenaean period, they hadn't seen those Mycenaean sites. They were buried. There are also differences sometimes in the shape of weapons that we find in the Greek world after the Mycenaean period compared to what are described in Homer's poems. And also, Homer describes certain of these weapons which don't fit what we find in the ground. And here's another critical element in the story. We know that the Mycenaeans, or at least some small number of them, could write, because we have the Linear B script, which we can read. There is no clue that there is such a thing as writing in the Homeric poem. There's one very abstruse clue where somebody seems to know something about it, but fundamentally it's an illiterate society, and that is a major difference between the world of Homer and the Mycenaean world. Some other differences. Homer's kings, if you just see how they live, what they do, what their wives do, how they are treated by their fellow noblemen, they are, in a relative sense, very weak, very short on power, and really quite poor compared to these Mycenaean kings that were the results of whose work and lives we see at places like Mycenae. Remember, I tried to emphasize how rich you would have to be to undertake the building of the temple, to undertake the construction of one of those beehive tombs. You had to be very confident, because it was going to take a long time, a fantastic amount of labor, a tremendous amount of money to do that. There is no evidence in Homer that anybody had that kind of wealth or that kind of power. What do the queens in Homer do in their spare time? Or maybe it's not their spare time, maybe it's their regular time. Well, one of the things that they do, in fact, when the Homeric heroes refer to their wives, there are really only two places that they seem to be associated with. One is the bedroom, and the other is the loom. What these ladies are doing is weaving cloth. Now, that's not what queens do. I'm sure the Mycenaean queens didn't do that. But it's very, very interesting that that is what the Homeric queens do. Well, how are we to explain the discrepancies that are so great between these worlds? And the answer that almost everybody now accepts without argument is that these poems were created orally and passed on orally, that they were not written down, and so that what we have in the poems of Homer reflects centuries of bards passing on bits of the poem or the poem in various versions, being always creative. I mean, any bard if by analogy we know about bards in the modern world, we have some evidence on that. Milman Parry, a Harvard scholar, back in the 20s, went to Yugoslavia to live in the mountains in the backwoods, and he lived with people who still had these bards around, who created sort of epic narratives of considerable length, nothing resembling Homeric length, I must say, nothing that long, but long enough in which they would tell the same stories in verse and music, and you could recognize the story as you went from bard to bard, but every bard added and subtracted things to suit his own talents. That's the idea of the game. And then Parry demonstrated, by careful scholarship of the Homeric poems, that that is the way the Homeric poems were, in fact, I want to use the word stitched together, because in the ancient Greek world, the people who sang, recited, created the poems of the Homeric epics were called rhapsodes, and that means stitchers of songs. So what you have to imagine is sometime back, I would argue, in the Mycenaean period, somebody began making up one of these songs, telling the story of Greeks going to attack the city of Troy. And that for centuries thereafter, different rhapsodes repeated that, but elucidated that, illuminated that, extended it, changed it, tried to improve it, and sometimes they added stuff. They were alive in the 10th century, some of them were alive in the 9th, and certainly some of them were alive in the time of Homer in the 8th. So that what we have before us is that kind of product, and that will explain both the similarities and the differences. And that is what underlies our interpretation of how the poems got to be what they were. So what world, what is this world like that emerges from the world of Homer? Even, we don't have to make up our minds in advance whether it was a real world or a completely fantastic one, but at least let's see if we can describe what world it looks like. And I'm going to focus my attention on what you might call the political side of that society as it reveals itself in the poem. We hear about key individuals, and I've used, last time I mentioned to you, 2 words. I think I did, but I'll mention again this time. The head of the expedition to Troy, Agamemnon, the sort of generalissimo of that expedition, is called Wanax. When you drop the W, as the Greek later dialects did, it becomes Anax in later Greek. He is, so far as I know, and I think I'm not forgetting, he is the only human being referred to in the poem in that way. There are, however, an individual in the poem who is referred to as a basileus. The plural is basileus, which is normally and regularly translated as king. And that's right. For instance, in historical times, when the Greeks referred to the great king of Persia, who was a real king and powerful figure, a king in every sense, the word they used for him was basileus. But we quickly see that the people referred to as basileus in Homer are not like the great king of Persia. They are much lesser figures. I'll come back to that in just a moment. The Mycenaean kings we know, thanks to the Linear B tablets, were referred to, the singular once again, as Wanax, and the plural is Wanaktes. But in Homer, the term is reserved for Agamemnon or for gods, but not for any other human being. And that raises the question, why is Agamemnon Wanax? And that, I think, we have to understand as being because of his function in the situation. Namely, there is a multi-city invasion of Troy being carried on by these Mycenaean Greeks. Agamemnon has been chosen as the generalissimo, and that is what gives him temporarily the title of one ox. I would imagine, I'm very confident, that after the War of Troy, if Agamemnon had been allowed by his wife to live for more than a few minutes after he set foot at home, he would no longer be called one ox, but would be called Basileus, like the other rulers of their local towns. You remember I suggested that in the Linear B tablets, when there's a reference to a Basileus, he's clearly well below the one ox. And some scholars suggest, in a persuasive way, I think, that these Basileus may have been village chieftains, but that's as high as they got. But it's very interesting that when you get to historical Greece, as we shall see, there are no Wanaktes, but there are, at least according to tradition, Basileus. But there's no Basileus has anything like the clout that the Mycenaean kings did, and of course we don't hear of any of them who have even the temporary special power that Agamemnon has. No human being is referred to as one ox in the period of historical Greece. And of course, the kings, when we see them in Homer, do not have a bureaucracy, do not have scribes. How could there be scribes? They didn't know how to write. There are no inventories. These are not rich guys with fantastic quantities of stuff that has to be cataloged and inventoried.